Welcome to the Golden State Association of Christian Schools Catalyst Session. We are here with Dr. Bergman, and we have started a series on helping teachers help students who struggle. And I appreciate Dr. Bergman and her expertise in this area. Today we're going to talk about study skills, this whole idea of independent learning. That's one of our goals as teachers, is to have our students learn independently. And so I have asked Dr. Bergman to come and share with us study skill tips that not only would help a child who is struggling, but would help any of our students in our classroom. These tips, these strategies that you're going to hear today will help the below average, average, above average, however you want to describe your class setting here. And so let's start out with the competencies. There's several things that we would expect students to be competent in. What would be some of those?
Well, the first, of course, is acquiring information. And for our learners that have learning disabilities in particular, they may not acquire the information the same way as their peers. Some of them have difficulty with reading, and we'll talk more about that in another session. But they have to find a way that they can acquire the information, and after that to record the information. And again, some of them have great difficulty with writing, and so we'll talk a little bit about some of the things they can do to make that easier for them.
Yeah, even the simple task of copying work from the board to the paper, from a textbook to the paper. I mean, that's what we're talking about when we mention recording and stuff, how important it is. But as teachers, I can actually, if I'm honest, get really frustrated with students who can't simply copy work accurately. But as you are mentioning there are certain needs that need to be addressed to help the student with that.
Their brain just is not processing what they see and connecting it with what they need to write. It's a processing disorder.
Right. So what would be some other competent things?
Organizing. Oh, our students struggle with organizing
And
information.
teachers.
Yes.
And teachers.
Oh, did you see my note page?
True.
And then synthesizing it, being able to put it into a form that actually uses some of their creative skills, but they just have difficulty moving that information into a form that they can do something with it. All of this is part of the processing disorder that they have, and so it's very difficult for them. Remembering, a lot of our students have problems with memory, and then taking tests. I think that throughout my career I've had more parents ask me, how can I help my student take tests? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that too.
I'm looking forward to this, and so with that in mind, let's just do a dive into some of the instructions that you would give for this.
The first thing that, if I was talking to teachers, I would say you have to teach these skills explicitly. I am amazed at how many teachers will give an instruction like summarize, and the student is sitting there, they don't know how to summarize. So you've got to teach them explicitly, and that means you have to model it for them, not just putting it on the board, but explaining your thought process. And then once you model it, then you guide their practice until they're able to do it independently. And so that's very important. Another thing that we have to realize is that they need a lot of review and rehearsal. And those are two different things, but they're very important, not only to review the material, but to have the student rehearse it.
Yes.
And then time management. And I say this with hesitancy because it is so difficult, not only for our students with disabilities, but for all students. And one of the problems is they can't estimate time. They come right up to the day before something is due, And maybe they even say, oh, Mom, I have this paper due tomorrow. And Mom's saying, why didn't you tell me a week ago? So one of the ways to work with that is to practice it, to have them estimate the time and then see how long it actually takes them, and to begin to get a realistic grasp of estimating time.
How would you, when it comes to estimating time, what would be the age group where you would start to really see an inability to estimate well? At what age would we expect to see that show up?
Well, I think you can see it at a very early age. A child that doesn't allow enough time to get dressed,
Okay.
things like that. But you really see it taking hold probably when they start having homework. I think then you begin to see that they
Okay.
don't allow enough time. I think that would probably be the earliest.
So it's not a simple thing of just procrastination.
No.
Oh, this child procrastinates and procrastinates. It could actually be they struggle to be able to estimate the time needed for the task.
And I know as an adult, sometimes I think, oh, I'm going to run these errands and I'll be back in 2 hours. And I come back after someone calls me several
Right.
times and come in late.
Right, right. Okay, what would be some other time management things?
Scheduling. And I know that is hard because we think we taught them to schedule. They should be able to do it. But having a visual reminder is important. And I always had my students schedule to plan their assignments ahead of time. If they knew that they had an English test on Thursday and they had a paper due on Monday, put those on their calendar, but also breaking them into the steps that are required to prepare for those. Now, I'm talking about high school students, but younger students too. I've seen some of the teachers have sent home the schedule of what should be done each day, and then the parents sign, and so I know
Right.
a lot of you are doing that. But to plan regular study times is important too. If a child doesn't have a plan for a study time, it gets
Right.
to be overlooked. And taking time to maybe even to just 5 minutes a day, but they know there's going to be a test over their social studies assignment, and so they should start early, just reviewing 5 minutes a day so that they're ready. And to also, if they have a schedule and they know the things that they're going to be doing that day during their study time, and they are able to check everything off, then have some sort of a reward for it.
Yes, I actually, in my chores at home, even if I've already done the chore but I hadn't started my list, I'll write that chore down just for the pleasure of crossing it out. So I like lists and checklists.
Right.
One of the things our school did during the whole virtual learning experience to help our parents and students with time estimation was we put on our assignment the expected time it should take for a child to do that, to help the parents be able to also kind of manage the day, the morning. And then if the child was taking too long, there could be some strategies involved with that. So I think that's something that teachers can do in helping parents figure out whether it's taking too much time or not is
That's a great idea.
including the time expected, I
Right.
should say there. Well, this is good. Let's talk about some skills, specifically about study skills. We have 4 that we want to address today in a little bit more in depth. And so the first one that we're going to talk about, actually Dr. Bergman's going to talk about, I'm the layman here, so I'm learning. The first one is note-taking. What would be some things here that you would suggest that we listen and strategize, as it were, and implement in our classrooms?
Okay. Note-taking is really something that I think is hard to get students to realize the importance, but it is important. And it requires a deeper cognitive processing for our students because they have to be able to listen and filter and write,
Very
and all of
difficult.
those are difficult tasks. And so one of the things that I just want to call to your attention, and I know I've mentioned it or alluded to it before, but the fact that a learning disability is a neurological processing disorder involving language. So the brain actually is not processing the information the way those of us without a disability would process it. So when they're taking in auditory information or visual information, the brain is not handling that in the same way. And so to ask them to do a task that requires them to either see something and write a note or hear something and write a note, we're asking them to do something that is that is specifically their disability area.
It's like they can't multitask at all with, am I listening correctly?
In the areas that involve that processing disorder,
Right.
yes.
Okay.
And so because we're asking them to do that, we need to think about ways we can change some of the things we're asking them to do. And you may say, well, note-taking is note-taking. But if they're having difficulty paying attention and they're having difficulty writing fast enough to keep up, they're already concentrating on what they're writing and they're getting behind and they're not keeping up with what's being said. I'd like to share with you something that one of my adult sons shared with me, and I thought it was just unbelievable until I tried it. He got in trouble in school because he took notes by drawing pictures, and they thought he was just playing around. And he said to me one time, he said, "Mom, I can tell you what they said by looking at my picture, but what I want you to try is I want you to try to take notes by drawing a picture." And so I did, and I was so engrossed in what I was doing in that picture, I lost everything that was being said. And he said to me, "That's what happens to me when I try to write notes in words. I'm concentrating so much on the words that I've lost everything that's being said."
Yes.
And that gave me a whole new appreciation for note-taking
Right.
after he did that. But they can do certain things. We can do certain things to help them. We can give them notes in some sort of visual format. I love concept organizers.
Yes.
So that's one way. But we can also give them a visual that has to be labeled, especially a science class or something that involves a map. Anything that they can label is much easier for them than writing notes. When I taught history, U.S. history for children with learning disabilities, we did visual representations for each president. And so at the end, they could remember that picture, even though they probably wouldn't have remembered any notes they had taken.
And in, like using a timeline, you have the date, but you visualize the event with a picture.
Right.
And they can remember those things.
Right.
That's great.
And then also, if they are going to take notes, ask them to take words or phrases, not whole concepts. I used to like to write out the notes, the outline, and just leave blanks for them to fill in key words. And then they could follow along with what they were hearing, what was in their notes, and then put in the critical words. Sometimes they can use abbreviations. We do it. We put a W for with.
Right.
So they can learn some of those. Assure them that spelling does not count. Don't worry, just so
Right.
they can remember what they were writing.
Right.
And underline things that they don't understand to be
that's-
able to come back to it. If the teacher gives them something and they're not understanding it, just underline it. Don't get caught up in trying
That's a
to
good
figure it
idea.
out.
Yeah.
And if they miss something, just draw a line and they can ask the teacher later or another student, "Hey, I
Kind
missed
of
this."
create their own fill in the blank on their notes.
Right. try to encourage them to listen actively, to be able to connect to what they've learned before.
That's good. I know for me with my secondary students, I'll make a copy of the PowerPoint slide with the the notes on the side that allows you to write more notes. And that way for my students who struggle with the processing as they listen and write at the same time, the main part of the information is there, and then they can add to it in their own words, and that has really been helpful.
That's a great strategy, yes.
Yeah,
So, very good.
So anything else with note-taking that we should know?
Right. Well, one thing that I liked, there's a lot of different formats for taking notes. Some people like the Cornell notes, and there's various ways. But one that I particularly like is one that has 3 columns, and one column is triggers. And the teacher can fill those in, or they can have the student. But those are words that they specifically need to know something about. And then there's a column for what they hear in the lecture or whatever is being presented in class. And then there's another column for what they read. So they have the prompt, and then they put in the details. Or even giving them the outline with just the headings and then numbering, so they know how many supporting details you want.
That's good.
And
we're going to move to the second skill that we want to highlight with these study skills, and it is the expression of learning. So tell me, what does this phrase mean, expression of learning, and what would be some strategies?
well, how would they be able to express that they have learned it?
Okay.
If we assign a 5-page paper to some of these students, we're not going to get.
No, we're not.
So there's part of it comes before they express, and that is allow them to use audio text.
Okay.
It is so helpful for them to be able to hear it, and I like to have them read it along with what they're hearing. I think that just helps. Another thing is to have them use a skill that we call SQR3.
Yes, and I have that right here.
And
Okay.
many teachers use this just as part of their instruction. So I'm going to tell you how it's done with most students, and then I'm going to tell you a way that we can possibly help our students to do it better.
Yes, and let's first start with what it actually stands for in case some teachers aren't as familiar with it. The S,
Is survey.
Okay, and then question, and then read, recite, and review.
Right.
And I know you're going to explain those, but I wanted to make sure that everyone saw those right off the get-go. So go ahead and share that.
So when they read, they're going to, or I'm sorry, when they survey, they're going to survey the reading assignment and get an idea of the different pieces that are in there, looking at the subheadings and things like that. But they're going to survey so that they have an idea what they're going to cover. Then questions. Sometimes the teacher gives them questions and they need to look at those. Sometimes they're at the end of the chapter. Sometimes the teacher will have them come up with questions that they want to look for as they read. And then they read to answer the questions. And then when they finish, they review the main points that they've read, and then they recite them in some form so that it'll aid memory.
Yeah, let me mention right here too, because I think for those who may not have a learning disability, they're listening to us going, this is what we just automatically do. And I think we need to just pause for a moment and realize that not every student automatically does this in their learning. And so for us to dissect all of these different elements of learning, it may seem mundane and it may seem tiresome to the average teacher, but we've got to break these parts down individually to help these students. And I want to just make sure that we insert that in there as we talk about these
Right.
strategies.
And breaking strategies into the steps is critical, but it's also critical to use explicit instruction. I've mentioned that several times, but model it for your students. Help them
Correct.
to know what it is you want them to do and how you're thinking through the process. That's just such a critical piece.
Now, you mentioned to me earlier when we were talking about this session that this SQ3R or R3 was overwhelming or could be overwhelming to children with special needs because it's like coming at them all at once if we don't break it down.
Right.
So what would be some strategies that you would give?
Well, I'm going to tell you a way that teachers may not like, but it works. If you give a chapter to a high school student with a learning disability, whether it's science or history, and you tell them to read it for the next day, most of them will look at the length of that chapter and say, I can't do it. And that's where they stop. Whether you have them survey and question and read, review, and recite, they can't get through that assignment. So one of the things we can do is take and modify the same strategy, and it's called multi-pass.
Okay.
And the first pass is survey. And we ask them to read the title and the introduction, then go to the end of the chapter and read the summary, and look at the illustrations, and then to maybe even go back to the table of contents and see how does this all fit with what we've been talking about in previous chapters. Then the second step is to size it up. And with that, they're going back and they're looking at the illustrations and they're reading the caption and they're saying, why would this illustration be in there? What does this have to do with what we're talking about? And question, try to answer the questions. Can they just from what they've surveyed get some of the answers to the questions? And then once they do that, they want to look at the words and to be able to see the vocabulary. That vocabulary is critical to their understanding. I'm going to talk more about that in another spot. But if they understand the vocabulary, they understand a lot of the content. And then as they look at the headings, scan and begin to see if they can find the main idea of what's going on and see if they can find answers to some of the questions and then put them in their own word. They don't have to read everything. They're just scanning, maybe looking for words that would stand out, that would say, this is the question, the answer to the question. And then the third step is to sort out and pass. And here they specifically read the question. And if they can answer it, they go ahead. If they can't answer it, then they mark it and they'll come back to it once they've answered the ones they can. And if they can't answer it, they come back, they scan the headings again to see if they can find where it would be, and when they find it, they paraphrase it. And so they're really not reading everything in the chapter, but they're reading enough that they get the idea, and because they're looking at each section and picking out something of importance in it, they begin to get a picture for the concept.
So teachers should not get hung up on the child reading every single word in the assignment.
That's right.
We want them to understand the content. And so I think this is a great process for our teachers to remember in this. So the next step then would be some question words.
Right, and I gave you, I believe it's 3 pages of question words.
Right, we're going to pop these up so that you can see them. So we're not going to actually talk through every single word. So you'll see this on your slide as we're talking, so that you have the information without us, talking through all of them. But what's the basic concept of question words?
I had came across this idea when I had students, grad students, that I would say something like, analyze this And then they would come back and say, what do you want me to do?
Right.
And I know most of our students don't have to do that, but a lot of our students do. And so when we think about just the word analyze, and it means to break into parts and analyze examine, I don't want to use the same word, examine each part, well, then it makes sense. So there's a whole list here, everything that I could think of, and that I used another source too, that came up with words that are commonly used in directions so that they know what you're asking. I don't know if as teachers you ever get an answer on a test and you're saying, but that isn't what I asked for.
Right.
And so hopefully this will help. Now, do I want you to sit down and lecture your students on each of these words and tell them what it means? No. But as you use them, make sure they understand, and maybe even have a chart available for them or a handout for them so that they can check and see specifically what you're asking.
Yeah, and this leads us to the context clues, where we can teach our students to look at the context to understand what's being asked of us.
This is especially critical in vocabulary because our students, if they have to take a dictionary and look up every word, and then if it's a younger child, the dictionary is usually at a higher level and it's difficult, they're just going to skip over that word. Well, how are they going to know what that word means? And it's context clues.
Yes.
And so teaching them to be able to look for the definition contained in their reading, look for the description, how that word is described, how it's being used, and just looking at contrast. Sometimes you can tell from things that are being contrasted what it means, and then comparisons or synonyms. So if they learn to use these context clues, it's really going to help them in their reading.
Yeah, I have fun modeling this in my literature class, and I let students pick one word that they think I might not know. And we look at the paragraph, and sometimes I really don't know what the word means. And we look at the paragraph and I make a guess, and then we look up the word to see how close I am. But the idea of modeling that context vocabulary, I think, is just one step to show students that we don't need a dictionary by us all the time to try to figure out what things mean.
And I like the fact that you said modeling, because it's a great opportunity when a teacher reads something to help them. They model how they find out the meaning.
And I'm surprised at how many words I don't know.
I think we all are that way.
Right. This is a great segue into our third skill that we want to talk about, which is memory.
And it's very important that a teacher, when they begin a unit or a lesson, aid the students by making the vocabulary and the concepts actually highlight them for the students, explain them, so that they're not beginning a unit with no idea what the vocabulary means. Help them make connections to prior knowledge. They're going to remember what's meaningful. And so if you can connect it to what they already know, it aids in the meaning. Visual aids are so important for memory. I used to, when I taught the high school history, I would always start a unit with some sort of video, because they could remember that, and it would get them just to have a feel for that time period, just things that I didn't want to take time explaining how they dressed and what their customs were, but they could pick it up from the video. The other thing is, when you're talking about memory and you realize that some students have a difficult time, control the amount of material that you want them to remember and the time that you're expecting them to deal with that. You don't want to overload them either in time or in amount. Another thing is to provide time for rehearsal and review. Oftentimes teachers don't purposely do that. And then mnemonic devices are so helpful. I think we all have our favorites and we use them all the time.
Right.
and teach them to apply it. You can teach the students a mnemonic mnemonic device that they need to apply to mathematics, and if they don't know how to use it, it doesn't help them to know it. And then emphasize how they're meaningful. Living in Michigan, I know that there's a mnemonic for the Great Lakes, and before I lived in Michigan, it had no meaning whatsoever. But now that I live there, I can remember which lakes and where they are. Visualization of the key word is important, keywords, but it's difficult for our students that cannot visualize. A student that has difficulty with spelling probably can't visualize those words. My mother used to always tell me to visualize the word, and then I could just see it in my mind and write it. Well, that doesn't work for everybody. And so many students don't have those visual images, but they may have an auditory memory where if they hear it, they can remember it. And so for students like that, it's important for them to be able to actually rehearse it and be able to hear themselves saying it. Another thing is some students can remember pictures and diagrams, and I think we've probably had the experience where we can remember on such and such a page of a textbook there was a diagram. Now if I could just remember what's on that diagram. And I mentioned before to let students take notes in whatever format is best for them. Another thing is organizing an association, and we do need to help them arrange material in an organized manner. If they, again, I go back to the concept organizers, but if they can use one that puts information in categories, that's very helpful. And then again, ways like the mnemonics are very good. Another, I mentioned rehearsal, so I've already mentioned that, but it's also effective to cluster and to chunk information.
Cluster and chunk.
Right.
I like that.
So
what does that mean?
Okay. So if they cluster it, if they have a lot of information from a chapter and they can cluster similar topics and statements and concepts together. So some people do it with a web type drawing, others just list it, but they're clustering it together. Chunk is when you take information and rather than having them learn the whole big piece, you take chunks of it. So that they can learn it in small sections. Like my grocery list, there's the dairy section.
Right. Yes, and we don't want to overwhelm them, so that's some great strategy tips. Let's move to our fourth and final skill that we're going to talk about today, and that is test taking. What would be some tips here for maybe some overall test taking strategies, and then I'm going to ask you specifically tips for the different kinds of questions that we may ask a student.
And I think that's a very popular question with teachers and with parents. They want to know how to help their students take tests. And one of the things is that to create study aids, like the concept organizers, flashcards, things that you can use to help review the information for the students. Some students even like to use, I say a tape recorder. I don't know, do we still use tape recorders? But
we have voice memo on our phones.
That's it, okay. But to record it and then to listen to them say it, that is a strategy that some of our students use, and but not tape recorders. And I like to suggest that for my students that they spend at least 5 minutes every day reviewing before the test, so they don't wait till the night before. However, there is a certain advantage to also reviewing the night before so that it's fresh in their minds. They need to learn about the test. They need
Right.
to learn, are they going to be penalized for guessing? How is the teacher going to weight the questions? Is the essay question worth more than the true-false questions?
Right.
Just different, even asking the teacher ahead of time, is this going to be all true-false, all? And I used to feel that when I took a class, if I could take one test from the teacher, I was fine after that because I knew how they were going to test. But most teachers will tell you about their tests if you ask. They need to learn how to predict questions as they study. What would this teacher ask me about this material? And then to think positive. So many of our students go in feeling that I can't do this. So, and in fact, with some of my students, I would give them a test ahead of time to study, but that was the one I actually graded. So that that took that pressure off of them thinking that it was a test.
Right.
It was a practice.
It was a practice.
Yeah.
That's great. Now you mentioned a resource, the Pirate Strategy, which I'm going to guess that several of our teachers are familiar with that, Preparing to Succeed. But what would be some highlights of that resource that you especially like?
Well, I think it's really important for the student to investigate the instructions. Make sure that they understand, read carefully, and not just read lightly and respond without understanding.
Yeah, his 3 R's are really helpful there. That read, remember, is it recite or reduce? Reduce.
Right.
And those are really helpful in that.
Right, they are. So it's read, remember, and reduce. And also, another one that I like is abandon, or I'm trying to remember the first. Answer or abandon. I know,
Right.
I remember the abandon part, but
Right.
answer or abandon. And if you abandon it, turn back at some point. Sometimes further in the test, it'll just spark a memory and you can go back. Don't spend a lot of time on the ones you don't know. Maybe a mark on the side so that you know you want to come back to it.
Okay.
And sometimes if you think of the words, we're going to talk about them with the tips, but if you think about the words that are being used, that helps you know a little bit more about how to answer.
The expectations of it.
Right.
Right. With the little bit of time that we have left, let's talk about those tips here.
Okay.
All right, so tips for answering true-false questions.
Okay, and one of the things is to realize that, and make our students realize that even though most of it is true, if one point is false, if one word is false, it's false. And so helping them to know that. And then another thing that is just sort of a tip is qualifying words. If it says all or always or none, those absolute words, chances are it's false.
It's false.
If it says usually or approximately or those are usually true statements. So it's just the way the teachers word them. Another thing is a double negative. Cross out both negatives and see if it's true. And the last one that I have for that is that your first impression is usually right. If that's what you thought the first time, unless there's something that you say, oh, I didn't read that right, then stick with your first answer.
My less professional way of saying that to my students is go with your gut. That's not as professional, but it sounds good. What about tips for answering our matching questions?
Okay, first of all, make sure that you have the same number of in each column, because sometimes teachers will put extra words in there and you want to know if you've got some extra words to play with, and sometimes they'll let you use a response more than once, and so you've got to know what you're doing, but read all of the words before you ever start matching. And then you have to be very careful to make sure that you're focusing on the details of the item, because sometimes the words are very close and you're saying, well, it could be this or it could be that. So you're going to have to learn, or if a teacher, teach the students to focus on the details.
And that's where that answer or abandon comes into play here of of waiting to answer that, coming back to it after you've crossed off other options.
Right.
And it does help you with that.
And that's what I was going to say, cross them
see?
off as you eliminate them, and
Right.
that, if there's one left, that's the one that goes with it.
Yes. All right, tips for answering multiple choice questions.
Okay, multiple choice questions, you want to be sure to read all the possibilities. A lot of teachers structure their questions so that they have 4 choices. 2 of them are obviously not right, and 2 of them are very close. So don't select an answer until you've read all of the options. Also, check and see if any of them are all of the above or A and B, because oftentimes those are in there because the teacher couldn't limit it to just one. So those are usually a good choice. Read the STEM with each of your if you can't decide between 2, read the question and the response together, then read the question and the other response together, and that may help you determine which one really makes the most sense. And then if you're not penalized for guessing and you come down to guesses, and these are just possibilities, they're not absolutes, but the longest option is often correct. The option in the middle is often correct. The most complete option is often correct. The first time they use all of the above or none of the above is usually correct. And then going back to the qualifiers, if it's usually or most of the time, then that's a good indicator. If it's an absolute, it's probably not. So going back to some of the overlap with true false.
Well, this is good. So our last one, tips for answering completion questions.
Okay, and this one is a little bit more, a little bit less precise, I would say. But first you want to know if it can be more than one word in the blank. And secondly, they say that the longer the blank should be an indication of what might go in there, but I don't know if that's always true. But read the question to yourself, and as you hear it being read with the word, see if it makes sense. See if it's grammatically correct. And sometimes that's an indication. I have students that will respond, and I think if you just read it in the sentence, you would know that that's not a good word to put in there.
Yeah, teaching them the cues on those.
And I think that's pretty much it for the...
These have been very helpful tips. Now, you have some instructional activities. We could list those till we're blue in the face of those. And we actually would encourage our listeners to list some strategies of helpful tips, maybe some helpful games that you use in the classroom that would help all of us gain some insight. You list off just a few of them there in your notes. What would be some of them? Word
association maps are fun, and students enjoy them, and yet it helps them to learn. Add a part, of course, with prefixes and suffixes are helpful. Click and clunk, Jeopardy, and then I like study groups. I think there's a lot to be said when you can actually discuss something with another student. Sometimes they will bring in things that you hadn't thought of, help refine your answers, and so I like study groups. And then learn these words, and I can't emphasize vocabulary enough.
Vocabulary.
I have to tell this with the test taking. I took a test, a certification test, on a subject that I knew nothing about when we were working on teacher certification tests. And just from knowing the vocabulary, I was able to pass that test. So that vocabulary is crucial. And knowing, you can look at a question, and because you know the meaning of the vocabulary, you can figure out the answer, even if you don't know all the details.
Yes, it's kind of like the Jeopardy.
Right.
There are clues in the question that let you know what that answer is. So this has been very helpful. So thank you very much, and I trust that these study skill tips will be helpful to you, not only for students who struggle, but students who are excelling. We want you to keep on succeeding, so thank you.